Good morning, everyone. Today we'll move on with our topic. Next topic for this semester. As you can see, I chose the theme for today. Until I will get something from you, I will try to focus on things that I will miss this year, and one of them will be the Aggie Band. I got one of my kids is a big fan of the Aggie Band. One of the reasons we used to go every year. Every game was to watch the band walk in the stadium. So that's one of the things I'm going to miss this year. And if you have things that you're going to miss, then send them over. Okay, let's start. Okay, so today we'll move on and talk about rationalism in IR. First of all, as always, beginning with the topic from our last meeting. So I talked about the domestic politics and the effects on international interactions, how internal demands that are reside within the state shape behavior in this level. I used the first framework that I used mostly was the Putnam two-level game framework. The fact that states have win sets. Win sets includes all the possible agreements that can be reached at the international level, but reminding you that all those agreements have to be accepted also by the domestic level, level 2, which represents different sizes of those win sets, and there's different conditions that affect those win sets. But overall, the more options are there in those win sets, the more likely it is that negotiation between actors in the international level will be agreed upon, thinking also about the fact that those that negotiate those kinds of agreements understand that they have to make sure that those agreements are accepted at the domestic level, level 2. So that's the idea of the two-level game. Again, a way to illustrate the fact of internal or domestic demands and how they're going to shape international outcomes. Then I talked about two specific papers in order to give a little bit more of a real-world application of those dynamics. The first was the Cook paper, which used the different structure of governments, of democratic governments, and how that shapes the duration of conflict. The main finding that he showed that when the government is a coalition government, which has a lot of diversity, which means there's a lot of risk for some members of the coalition to defect, then those kinds of governments are more likely to end conflict earlier because they don't want to risk the collapse of the government. So different structural governments matters. Left-wing governments was another finding that he had. Left-wing governments are also more likely to end conflict earlier because they are viewed as less competent in addressing those kinds of issues. So again, those are different elements of the government dynamics, of the structure of the government, the types of government, and how they affect the international outcome, in this case, conflict duration. Then I talked about the effect of another domestic factor, in this case, public opinion, and also, again, domestic government structure, using the Orwell paper to show how that's going to affect the decision to use force to intervene militarily. And the example we talked about I expanded about was the Suez Crisis in 1956, comparing the United States, the British, and the French response to this crisis, and showing how the different structure of the governments in this case and the pressure from the public led to different decisions regarding the use of force, or different incentives to use of force, which eventually wasn't really resolved because Israel helped all of those countries resolve their dilemma by engaging in the act themselves. If you have any more questions about this domestic politics aspects, you're more than welcome to email me and come talk to me during office hours, come virtually, of course. And we'll, as we move along more now into the upcoming lectures, you will see a lot more how I'm combining structural elements or international system elements in the explanation of different outcomes in IR, as well as domestic politics explanations. Okay, so let's move on. Our first topic for today, for this week, is the theory of rational choice. We should view rational choice theory not as another theory of IR, instead as a general theory of behavior, which we can use as an analytic tool to formulate different IR theories. Think about it in the context that both neorealism as well as liberalism rely on this framework. So it's not a specific theory of IR, but this allows us to build those theories. So I'll give you some background. I'll keep a little bit more about the background, talk about definitions, how this framework fits within the research of IR, and then we'll talk about applications of that to explain some of the most predominant events in the field of international politics. So from a definition standpoint, rationality is a process in which we set objectives, and then we decide to, and then we examine all the available alternatives to achieve those objectives. Eventually, we select the one alternatives that's going to maximize our expected utility with regard to those objectives. The process of a rational decision choice is we assess each one of those alternatives. We assess their costs, their benefits, their risks for implementing this alternative in order to accomplish our goal. And we view the rational decision process as part of a strategic behavior between actors, because I'm one actor and I have to accomplish my objective with respect to other actors in the situation I'm facing. So I'm also accounting for what I expect other actors in this setting to behave, which means I'm assessing each one of those alternatives, their costs, their benefits, their risks, but I'm also accounting for how my using of those alternatives also matter for the other actor in the setting that we're talking about. So that's going to shape the evaluations of all the possible alternatives and the eventual selection. One of the features of the rational choice is its dynamic nature, and that's in the sense that individuals will select an alternative based on assessing all the alternatives and choosing the one with the high expected utility, but they will also constantly collect information from the environment and reassess their choices. If they are collecting feedback from the environment, telling them that their behavior, their choice is not leading to the expected outcome or to the most efficient outcome, then those individuals should update their behavior and choose a different course of action in order to achieve their objective with the highest possible utility. So that's the updating idea. If I'm getting feedback from the environment that my choices, my behavior is not efficient enough in accomplishing my objective, I should alter my behavior. The central benefit of rational choice theory, it's parsimony, it's simplicity. We view any type of behavior as calculated, purposeful behavior, and it has the intention to accomplish certain goals while paying minimum costs. So it's a very simple framework to explain behavior by any individual. It also produces very clear and observable implications that can be tested. And that leads to the third point here. Because they're very clear, they're also very common among many types of cases, among many types of individuals, which means that they can be generalized. I can use this framework to explain multiple types of behavior. Despite this very descriptive simplicity, there are several limitations. The primary limitation in this case is that in reality, this is a very problematic way to describe human behavior process, because humans have limitations on their cognitive capacity. We cannot really assess an infinite amount of information. It is very hard for humans to deal with high level of uncertainty. That this is one of the characteristics of reality, especially if you think about it in the context of international politics. Think about the level of uncertainty that some leaders face. It's impossible to actually deal with that. The rational choice models also overall disregards the effects of emotions and other psychological mechanisms in terms of explaining the decision process. So in practice, what those limitations mean is that instead of actually following the description of rational choice, which means I have an objective, whatever the objective is, and I'm assessing all possible alternatives in order to accomplish the objective, instead, what I'm actually doing is engaging in what Herbert Simon termed as what was called bounded rationality, which is a very limited form of a rational process, which means I will test several alternatives. Once I found one which seems satisfactory to me, I will accept that, and that's satisfying. I will test some alternatives, some number, 2, 3, 5, whatever that is. Once I found one of those alternatives which is satisfactory to me, and I like the outcome based on these alternatives, I will use this kind of, this is going to be my choice in this case. So that's the limitation of the rational choice and what we actually do in reality in opposite for, it's not really an opposite, but this is some variation of the the way that the classic rational choice model exists. So how do we apply this kind of modeling IR in a very general way? Rational perspective in IR view the behavior of international actors as intended to benefit their own interests, and any outcome is actually a result of a bargain between two actors or more, each of those actors trying to maximize her own objectives. So under this kind of prism, each political interaction is actually a game in which every relevant actor will behave in a way that's going to best accomplish their goals. While also, as I already mentioned, the strategic aspect of it, I'm also assessing the expected behavior of other actors in the game. So this figure provides us an example for a game between a government and a terror group. Each one of those sides will assess the expected behavior of the other based on the type of actions that the government will take. So this is two potential types of actions the government can take. And that's the expected behavior of the terrorist in this case. And what you have here, and that's part of the way that we use the rational choice model to explain behavior, is the expected costs and benefits. And that's allowed us to provide a very general explanation and expectations regarding what the expected behavior is based on those kinds of interaction. So rational choice theory is based on several assumptions. I want to talk about them now for a few minutes. First of all, it's agnostic about preferences, which means that we take preferences as given. We understand that every actor has some preferences, some things she wants to push forward, and we do not question the origin, the appropriateness, the soundness of those preferences. We do not have to agree with them. We just have to accept the fact that every actor has some preference, whatever that is. Order preferences means that there is some kind of ranking system among those preferences. So if we take three, for example, A, B, and C, so the actor will try to accomplish the most preferred outcomes. Let's call it A in this case. But, and that's reminding you again, the updating aspect that I talked about a few minutes ago, if a rational actor views that it's incapable of achieving preference A, it is a rational choice to go to actually the suboptimal choice. In this case, let's call it preference B, rather than preference C, which in this case is the least preferred outcomes, or getting nothing. So you're trying to accomplish the most preferred outcomes, but you also accept a less preferred outcome than accepting nothing. That's the idea of this assumption. Transitive preferences is a very basic logical argument that if preference A is better than preference B is better than preference C, then that means that preference A is also better than preference C. That's the idea of transitive preferences. And the last point regarding preferences is that they are stable, which means they do not change over time. Our behavior, again, coming back to the updating argument, our behavior may change based on the feedback that we get from the environment, but we still try to accomplish the same preferences. It may be that we shift from the most preferred outcome to the second preferred outcome, but those preferences remain the same. We may change our behavior. The last assumption in this case is the unitary actor assumption, which I talked about already when I talked about the realist and the material theories. Every actor is viewed as a single entity, whether it is a state, whether it is an organization such as a societal group, whether it is a rebel group, a terror group, and any kind of internal dynamic, internal composition, internal conflicts do not matter in the way that we view the choices made by those groups or those actors. What are some of the implications of relying on these assumptions is that by relying on those very relatively straightforward assumptions, we can derive very clear and observable implications which can be tested. For example, there's a series of studies that show, and we'll talk about them in the future, that suicide terrorism can be explained as a rational choice. And we'll get to that. I'm not going to go to that today. We're going to get to that when we get to terrorism. despite this oversimplification of those assumptions, which is again by design, it's simplifying reality. It's very, very simplifying assumption, but it's by design. They provide internal consistency. They can explain the behavior in a very consistent way. So they appeal as a general theory of behavior. Scholars and professional analysts love the use of rational choice models because they provide us with a framework to explain behavior in a very general way. Reminding you again, my discussion from the first week, how we try to build theories which are general theories. So by relying on the rational choice framework, we can explain behavior in a very general sense, whether it's the explanation of states that are democracies, states that are autocracies, terror groups, rebel groups, whatever that is. If we rely on the rational choice framework, we can build a very general theory of behavior. It's also very appealing to policymakers because it allows to simplify very complex political problems into clear representation. Think about this game model that I showed you a couple of slides ago. And that also yields a very clear set of policy responses to any kind of scenario, along with their expected chances of success. Policymakers love it when you give them possible chances of success. Instead of telling them, this is likely to happen, this is unlikely to happen, instead of telling them this has an 80, 70, 60% chance of happening. It helps them deal with the uncertainty, with the very complex reality they have to deal. I also talked about it a little bit more when I talked about the bridge between policymaking and theory. So this is a brief introduction of this rational choice framework, and now I want to talk about several of the applications, beginning with maybe one of the most, the largest questions in IR in this context. Can we use rational framework to explain the decision by states or by nations to engage in war? What you have here is a picture that I found online from the American Revolutionary War, and this is just an illustration of the way that wars were fought at the time. Two columns of soldiers stood in a certain distance, one from another, each raised their own rifles and shot in the other column. If you happen to be in the way of the bullet, you died. If not, you can shoot again. And when you think about it now, without going into the theory of rationality, you think about it, how can we even explain that as a rational behavior, standing like that, shooting against one another? So let's try and do that. The appeal of a rational approach to explain war is based on two aspects. First of all, past work tend to focus on specific conflicts and arguing that war was a rational option for the leaders that tried to promote their state's interest, because according to those explanations of very specific conflicts was that the expected benefits from war were much higher than the costs. So if benefits outweigh the cost, it's a rational decision to engage in war. That's one reason. The other one, and I'll get us back to some of the realist arguments. Realist arguments explain war as resulting from the structural international system. And this is a rational approach to explain war. And so this is the structure, the system that leads to the war and not the particular leader. So that means that if we use the rational choice framework, which is a general theory of behavior, which does not account for specific individuals, specific leader, Hitler, whatever that is, Bush, Obama, or Gaddafi for that matter, this is not the reason there is war. We're using a very general framework of behavior to explain this kind of a choice. So this paper by James Fearon, who is a professor at the University of Stanford, it's one of the most famous papers in IR over the last 25, 30 years. What he actually offers is a general framework to understand why war may be a rational choice by leaders. It is a framework which is both coherent from a theoretical standpoint and plausible from an empirical sense, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more. He begins by offering potential alternative explanations. One of them is that leaders may behave in an irrational way, which does not help us because we're trying to think about it from a rational standpoint. He also presents the option that leaders engage in wars because they have the possibility of enjoying the benefits, but they don't really pay any personal cost. In some cases, leaders may be out of their office because they lose wars, or maybe in some cases they may even be killed because of it. But in the vast majority of cases, they don't pay personal cost per war, so that's an explanation. But those are not rational explanations. So again, he also goes to some of the arguments that are based on the realist approaches, that there can be many what's called rational arguments to explain war from in the literature about realism and neorealism. For example, the international system is an anarchy, so states have to rely on self-help. All things we talked about: failures of deterrence, alliance formations, balance of power. All those explanations have rational foundations in them, and they can maybe explain war, but none of them account for one important basic point. And this is the point. Wars are costly, wars are risky. So if you're purely a rational actor, you should be able, actors in this case, which engage in this interaction, they should be able to locate this settlement before actually engaging in violence, which is costly and risky. That's his main point. So if we're trying to actually present a rational account of war, we have to explain why actors fail to reach those settlements, and they will favor the cost and risk of war of a violent conflict. So before we go into explaining why actually there are rational explanations to engage in war, he lays out the foundations of why wars from a rational standpoint should not be an outcome. And that's what he called the bargaining range. If you read the paper, I'm sure you stopped over and probably read that part more than once. That's okay. I also had to read it a few times in the first time that I read the paper. So I'll go over some of those ideas of what is the bargaining range. And you don't have to understand the math. You don't have to understand the small details of how this thing has come about, just to understand the idea behind that. So let's do that together. So the bargaining range is defined as the range of outcomes that both rational actors should accept instead of war. So let's look at the example in this case. Let's consider two states, states A and B, and they have a set of preferences, which we plot here on this interval between 0 and 1. The 0 and 1 are not specific numbers. They just represent two states of preferences. And A will prefer an outcome which is closer to this. This is the most favored outcome for A. And here in the point of 0, that's going to be nation B's favorite outcome. If they decide to engage in war, and we'll get to what exactly that means and why will they decide to do that, then there is some probability, P, which is unknown, and that's the probability that A is going to win the war and get everything it wants. And there's a probability which is going to be, in this case, 1 minus P, which again is a sum number, in which case B will win the war and B will get its most favorite outcomes. Okay, that's in the decision of getting to war. So now he uses some very basic math and explanations about utility of the actors in order to explain those other points on this interval. If it makes it easier for you to understand it, you can think about this interval as a territory, a disputed territory. On the one side, you have country A, and country A will be here because this is its favorite outcome. So if country A gets its favorite outcome, country A will get all the territory. It's going to be here. On the other hand, you have country B. Country B is going to be here. And if country B is going to get its favorite outcome, it's going to get all the territory. Okay, that might make it a little bit simpler. So let's look at some of those numbers. We talked about the 0 and 1, what they represent. Let's talk about these P minus and P plus. What he shows here, that if countries decide to go to war, the value that A will have for the war is going to be this point, P minus CA. P is the value that A, the probability that A is going to win the war. But we have to subtract from that the cost of war, or the utility from the cost of war in this case. So that's the value. If A is going to win the war, it's going to get everything. But just by going to war, this margin here, that's the value that A has for war. Same thing for B. B is on the other side of this interval. This is B's value for war. If B is going to win the war, B is going to get everything. But in this case, just by going into war, that's what B gets. Right? So those are the 2 points. Now, everything that goes between them is what he called the bargaining range. Everything between those 2 points, those P minus CA and those P plus CB, presents multiple points that they are all possible solutions that offer for both actors, both A and B, more utility than going to war. So this is the bargaining wage. Let's take this X as an example. In this case, X, this is the value that A will get from settlement X. Again, if this is the territory, if A will get this territory, size of this, it's going to be more useful to A than getting this just by going to war. Because yes, it's possible that A is going to go to war and win and gets everything, but it's also possible that A is going to go to war and lose everything. So it is better for A to get X than to get nothing. Remember, order preferences, it's better to get a suboptimal preference than getting nothing. The same thing goes for B. Everything that goes from here on the way until here is better for B than going to war, because this is what B is going to get from a war, from just going to war. If it's going to win, it's going to get everything, but it's going to lose, it gets nothing. So everything here is better than going to war. That's the bargaining wage. If we take a more extreme example for that, A can come to B and say, listen, I want to move the X here. And B should still accept that as an option rather than going to war, because this is still bigger than going to war. That's the idea behind it. The bottom line of all this discussion about all those lines and those different letters, which may confuse us, is that war is an inefficient solution, because there's always a possibility to find a solution that is better than war to any kind of actors. Here you can see very clearly how we propose, using this framework, a very general explanations to why it is better to find a solution than going to war. And a rational actor based on this argument should always be able to find this kind of settlement. In essence, what it means is that the cost and the risk of fighting open this wedge of bargain solutions that any actor which is either risk neutral or risk averse should prefer. And the fact that this bargaining wedge exists is based on the fact that war is inefficient, ex post. So all that is great. And Firon provides a very, very elaborate discussion that, again, you have to read probably more than once in order to understand. But once you understand it, it's a very elegant and simple explanation to why war is actually not a rational decision. But still, we're coming back to our questions from the top. Okay, so is there a rational explanation to war? So why then? Why do actually states go to war from a rational standpoint? I'm not using irrational arguments. So here, overall in the paper, it discusses three different explanations. And I'm going to focus on the first two. The first one is what's called private information and misrepresentation. So some of the common rationales for war are when actors miscalculate and overestimate their power or the willingness to fight. And the argument in this case is that this can be an explanation to war, but in the ideal case, if we go back to the bargaining range here, okay, actors should be able to communicate with one another and solve such problems. So if I believe that I'm more powerful than my adversary, in the ideal situation that both of us are rational and do not want actually to go into war, I will communicate with my adversary, I will give him the information, her the information, and we can find a solution. Yes, I may think that I'm stronger, but I can still lose the war. So it's rational on my sense to communicate that. Now, there is different ways that we can get to this miscalculations of power relations. One can be emotional commitment, which is a little bit more murky when it comes to rational explanations for war. The other one is the wrong assessments by analysts, which miscalculate the capabilities of themselves and provide this information to the leader. But I want to focus instead, and this is what I have here at this point, and this is what Firon is focusing in this case, is the third option, which is leaders hold some private information about their capabilities from a military standpoint, from a strategic standpoint, and they believe that this information skews the expected results, and they believe, as based on that, they believe that they're more likely to win the war. So they will inflate their own probability of winning the war because they think that they know something that their adversary does not know. some kind of military innovation, some kind of diplomatic solution, some kind of information that intelligence, secret intelligence that they possess that the adversary does not have. Couple of examples for what can be viewed as a private information. Now, from a pure rational perspective, only this third options of incentive to misrepresent information is rational, is the only one that's logical, because actors have different levels of information, so it makes sense that they will have different assessments of the likelihood of victory. Now, private information can be not just for a distribution of capabilities in this case. It can also be based on willingness to fight. So some actors may have private information, may know that they have much more, the issue at stake is much more important to them than the adversary believe. So they're much more willing to fight over that, but they think that the other actor does not know that. And they will have incentive to not reveal that information. So again, all those kinds of miscalculations in the ideal setup should be resolved with communication. But pre-war bargaining, if actors do decide on some level to negotiate between themselves before going into war, they will fail in locating this ideal outcome in the bargaining range, because there are strategic incentives to withhold or misrepresent some of this private information regarding power or regarding willingness to fight. What are these incentives? So there's three overall incentives in this case. States want to enjoy the benefits of winning a war or resolving a dispute in their favor. So they may exaggerate their willingness to fight or their capabilities, hoping to deter their challengers or their rivals and persuade them to make concessions. So those are strategic incentives to misrepresent my capabilities or my willingness to fight in order to reap some benefits from my rivals. Another incentive in this case is that states are concerned that if they will reveal their true capabilities or resolve, they will actually seem weaker. So they have incentive to conceal those so they can look stronger and therefore get a better bargain. The third incentive is that states may conceal their true willingness to fight because they don't want to appear as the aggressor. Now, if we combine each one of those incentives or all of those incentives with the fact that states may have this private information, then that presents for us a rational explanation to why leaders may arrive at this miscalculation and go into war. So war, according to this first explanation, is the combination of having private information along with incentives to misrepresent this information, which lead to potentially miscalculation of the likelihood of winning and war. Let's try getting examples for that, which will maybe clarify this argument a little bit more. So the example is the July 1914 crisis, the crisis that came before the beginning of the First World War. The beginning of the crisis was in late June of 1914 when a Serb national assassinated the heir apparent to the Austrian monarchy, Austria-Hungary monarchy, in late June. Austria has issued an ultimatum to Serbia, threatening, of course, violence. Now, Austria had beforehand a defense alliance or agreement with Germany, and Serbia had a defense agreement with Russia. So that's coming back, if you remember when I talked about the balance of power in Europe before 1914, that's parts of it. So there was a lot of communications, and Fearon in the paper provides a lot more specific examples for the entire dynamics that happened between the different members of this crisis. I want to focus in this case on the Germans and the British, because this is probably the main dynamic that led to the eventual outbreak of the war. So the Germans did not want to appear as aggressive at the early stage of this crisis, so they had incentives to misrepresent their intentions or their willingness to fight in the context of supporting Austria. So again, we go back to one of the incentives I talked about earlier. Germany knew how important that is to them to fight or to stay or to preserve Austria as an ally, but they had incentives to misrepresent that. In that case, they didn't want to seem as the aggression in the case of dynamics in Europe. Part of that was trying to ensure that the British will not offer too much of a strong of a response. And it actually was successful because early on, the British response was relatively weak, and that contributed to the escalation of the crisis in late July and into August of 1914. When finally both sides have actually revealed their true preferences or their true intentions, it was too late to reduce the tensions, and the war actually erupted. So in this case, actors had the incentives to misrepresent their private information, and therefore they risk inefficient war, all while trying to get a better bargain in this crisis in the summer of 1914. So this is just one example to this explanation. I'll talk a little bit more now about the second mechanism that Fearon discusses, and that's commitment problem. So commitment problem are structural conditions that create incentives for some states to renege on an efficient bargain outcome and attack. So in this case, two nations that already reached a bargain within the bargaining range, and because of structural conditions, one of them has incentives to renege on that bargain and go to war. And as a result, it creates rational incentives for the rivals of those actors to actually initiate war. So the basic logic of the mechanism is if one actor has an offensive advantage over her rival, then she has incentive to attack and reap the benefits of victory. And this is based on the structural condition, in this case, which is the anarchy in the global system, which complicates the ability to enforce bargains because there's no one central authority. So reneging on agreements is actually much easier. Now, this scenario is very much exemplary in preventative wars. So let's think about two actors, A and B, interacting over a long period of time. War is still an inefficient outcome. We still follow the rational idea that Fearon proposed, that war is inefficient, and they should be able to locate a peaceful solution within the bargaining range. Now, the fact that there is no third party to enforce the agreement, so they may have found some solution in the bargaining range, but there's no third party to enforce the agreement. So if one actor, in this case, let's call it actor A, become more powerful, then actor A has incentives to renege on the bargain and attack actor B. Now, at the same time, actor B, which may be viewed as the weaker state in this relationship, understand that dynamics, and this actor may prefer to go into war now in the current period than actually accepting a less favorable bargain in the future. So again, I'm explaining this as two events that happened one after another, but they actually happen at the same time. So while A is getting stronger, B understands that, and B would prefer under those conditions to go to war now before actually being relatively a lot weaker than A, and then having to accept this unfavorable outcome of the conflict in the future. So for actor B in this case, the cost of war in the current period now are lower compared to their decline in the power in the future, which means it is a rational decision to initiate a preemptive attack, a preemptive war, a preventative war. That's the idea behind the commitment problem in this case. And the fear of the future outcomes is not based on the private informations, as I talked about in the previous explanation that Fearon offered, but is actually based on those structural conditions which provide opportunities for one actor to renege on an agreement over the other, and then it provides rational incentives for this other actor to go into war. So again, as another example, Fearon also talks about, he also provides in a couple of examples, I'll talk about, again, Germany and Russia in this case. So the Germans preferred to go to war in 1914 because they were concerned about the constant growth in power that Russia was showing during that time. It had, from the German perspective, negative implications in terms of the ability of a growing Russia to exert its own influence in Europe, especially in the Balkans, which was the backyard for both of those countries. and in the case of a future war. So if those two countries will go to war after 1914, the Germans were worried about the potential power of Russia. So they preferred, under those conditions, to go to war in 1914 than in the future. Eventually, both of them pretty much suffer from the war, so we can talk about that in a different situation. But again, this is just another way to present this rational explanation of how choosing war over a bargain settlement is the outcome. Now, both the commitment problem as well as the misrepresentation, private information misrepresentation are two of the explanations that Fearon offers. It's important to understand that throughout his entire discussion, he still views war as not a rational. He views that the rational decision should be not to engage in war. That's why he calls those things, and you can see that in the title that I have here, and the title that he has for the paper, it's called rationalist explanations. Because the idea is that he rationalizes the behavior of actors to explain how they shifted away from the more efficient, rational outcome of no war into actually engaging in violence. So that's the idea behind this Fearon paper. And if you want to talk about it a little bit more, if you got a little stuck or you got a little confused about some of the discussion that he has there, you're more than welcome to come and talk to me about that. But again, the idea is not to understand, it's not important that you understand the math that he had there or the very small details about how is the utility of each actor. Is to understand the setting that he lays out, how we can think about rational types of explanation to explain this behavior. That's the idea behind the Fearon paper. Okay, I want to discuss for a few more minutes another example of applying the principles of rationality to questions of conflict behavior. And we'll do that with the second paper that you had for today, which was the Furman and Sesher paper. And the main topic that they describe is what's called extended nuclear deterrence. I'll talk about it in a second. From the rational choice framework perspective, so they highlight commitment problem. So that's the second explanation that Fearon talked about. And the type of action that states can employ to overcome or reduce the effects of commitment problems. So they focus on alliance commitment in the context of nuclear deterrence. So alliance between a nuclear power, such as the United States, for example, along with a non-nuclear country, such as South Korea, as an example. So can nuclear power deter attacks against their allies by simply announcing that there is a defense commitment between those two actors? So is words enough, or they must actually take action and they must deploy troops or weapons to signal this commitment? So the United States have to deploy troops to South Korea in order to prevent an attack from North Korea, for example, or is this enough to make the alliance between the United States and South Korea a public announcement? And the main challenge in this case is, again, coming back to the commitment mechanism, and is whether the United States can convince its adversary that it will not renege on this defense commitment and is willing to pay the cost of the conflict if the allies it attacks. So if the North Korea decides to attack the South, the United States have to convince the North that is willing to pay the cost and actually go into the conflict. Again, for a different geographical setting, if the United States has a defense commitment with the Ukraine and Russia sends military forces into Ukraine, does the United States enter the conflict and intervene, and if needed, actually use military forces in this kind of conflict? And that's the challenge that the commitment problem represents. So the authors talk about two different types of signals that can be used. The first is a public declaration of intention to defend an ally, so making this defense commitment public. The second one is a more concrete action taken, and that's the deployment of troops. They argue and they show a couple of examples that I have here, that the vast majority of defense pact or defense commitments signed over the last 60 years have very few signals of commitment beyond a verbal promise. So it's mostly a verbal commitment. A lot of the agreements signed by the United States include mostly a verbal commitment, and almost none of them have a troop stationed. For example, the commitment that the US has within the Rio Pact, which is to the nations in South America. Similar types of agreements are what the Soviets had with Finland during the Cold War, or the Arab League, which exists from the 1950s until today. So there is a verbal commitment to come to the help of an ally, but there's no Egyptian troops stationed in Jordan, for example. Now, a public announcement of the defense commitment is more likely to be useful because once it's a public declaration, it presents a risk and reputation costs for the patron state, again, the United States as an example, in the case that the United States will decide to renege on the agreement. This represents what's called a hands-tying or a commitment mechanism, which is a hands-tying mechanism. The objective of the signal sent by, in this case, the United States, is to manipulate its expected future payoffs. So the signal itself, making the defense pact with South Korea, again, within our example, public, is not costly, but it will be costly if the United States will decide not to uphold this commitment in the future. If North Korea will decide to attack South Korea and the United States will not come to its help, then it's going to be costly for the United States, especially in the context of its reputation, its credibility. Both of them will be at risk because of this reneging. Now, in the context of a nuclear power, then this kind of announcement is even more powerful because from the perspective of the United States, if we, again, using the example of the United States, North Korea, and South Korea, a signal sent by the United States as a nuclear power should deter North Korea from considering an attack against South Korea, because that might mean that the response of the United States as part of this defense commitment might involve nuclear weapons. So a nuclear capabilities makes this kind of commitment, this kind of mechanism even stronger. Before going into the empirical discussion that the authors have, I will stop for a minute to give you the attendance word of today. The attendance word is university. Please stay through to the end of the lecture. I have one more thing I want to talk about for a few more minutes after I'm done. Okay, so don't shut off the video now. Okay, so let's go back to this. There it is. They offer two propositions related to one another. The first is having a public defense pact with a nuclear power reduces the likelihood of being targeted in a military conflict. So again, keeping on with our example, if South Korea has a public defense pact with the United States, it is less likely to be the target of a conflict, of a military conflict. A more extreme version, or a more practical version of that, you can say, is that this commitment requires more than just a verbal act. So in this case, the proposition is that a nuclear power has to deploy troops into its protege in order to make the commitment stronger, and that's going to reduce the risk. So that's the second proposition. So a verbal act is not enough. You also have to deploy troops in this case. And the effect of troops is a lot more powerful because of those reasons. So the first, it can shift the local balance of powers in favor of the allies. So stationing American troops in South Korea will shift the balance of power in its favor and intended to prevent or stall an attack by the adversary. During the Cold War, the US had tactical nuclear weapons stationed in Europe, and they were intended especially for that, to stall the Soviet attack, not necessarily to stop it altogether, but to stall that, at least from that. So that's an extension of its deterrence. Another reason is what's called tripwire mechanism. If, let's go back to the example of the Korea, if the North Korea forces decide to attack South Korea, once American troops are stationed there, they are almost sure likely to be targeted in this case and harmed, which means that's gonna compel the United States to actually have much larger involvement in this conflict. So that's an escalation of the conflict between the North and the South because American troops that were deployed in the area were harmed. So that's another reason which makes the commitment by the United States to this defense pact much stronger. And the third one is that by putting troops on the ground, the commitment is presents a much stronger signal of resolve. It represents both political cost as well as economic cost and the risks of conflict in this case. Okay, before going into results, so this is part from the paper itself. This is a list of some of the defense commitment between nuclear powers and their allies from the second half of the 20th century. So you have here, some of them include the defense pact, such as the United States and Belgium, for example. Some of them do not include an official defense pact with the United States and South Korea, the example I kept on through this entire time. It's not an American examples only. So there's the Soviet Union with Hungary, for example, which had a defense pact throughout parts of the Cold War. Even Great Britain, along with Cyprus, even though they don't have an official defense pact. So this is some of the examples of what they have in their data. I'll talk about their main results before this specific figure that you see on your screen now. So they find support for the first proposition using a mechanism such as public commitment is useful in reducing the likelihood of crisis emerging. So having a verbal defense commitment between a nuclear power and its ally reduces the likelihood that this ally will be targeted in a military conflict. So deterrence in this case is extended just based on the fact that this is a nuclear power provides a verbal commitment to its ally. This is the hands tying mechanism that I talked about. At the same time, and this is what you see here on your screen now, placing nuclear weapons or nuclear troops, nuclear related troops on the ground does not deter aggression or conflict. The average rate of fatalities when a target hosts foreign nuclear weapons and when they're not, they're almost the same. Even when we account for the deployment years here, it seems like there is a substantial differences, but according to the findings that the authors have in the paper, this difference is not significant, which means essentially that all those bars represent pretty much the same types of results, is that placing nuclear weapons in an allied territory or troops in an allied territory from this specific perspective is not efficient in preventing aggression, and that puts a question mark on the effectiveness of such policy. At the same time, they argue that one of the alternative benefits of placing troops, for example, in South Korea, is that when a state is hosting the nuclear forces of a strong, great power such as the United States, it reduces the host nation's incentives or motivation to develop such weapons. So for example, think about it now about some of the discussions that came up in the news over the last couple of months, this time in the context of the Middle East, that because of worries about Iran and its aggression, Saudi Arabia, which does not have American troops stationed, or not large amount at least, is considering developing nuclear weapons itself. And that's the idea behind why maybe stationing troops in Saudi Arabia is useful, American troops in this case, because it's going to prevent them from actually going that route, developing nuclear weapons and extending the amount of countries that hold those kinds of weapons. So that's their findings. And again, that's the idea of how exactly you can use those kinds of commitment mechanism in order to overcome the challenges of commitment problems that were introduced by Fearon as one of the rationalist explanations for war, and this is one of their applications. If you want to read a little bit more, so the paper by Powell is a very famous paper also talking about the commitment problem as an explanation to war, and some of the other papers are also very interesting. One last thing, as I promised, later tonight, you will get an email from me with a link to the second task that you have, the survey. This is a survey that describes a national security scenario which involves the United States. And you will read about the scenario and you will be asked to state your opinion about that specific situation. So of course, there's no right or wrong answer. Just make sure that you answer honestly, properly. Make sure that you do this task seriously. You should know I'm able to monitor everything that you do in this task. So it should take you somewhere no longer than 15, 16 minutes, but it shouldn't take you less than about 9 to 10 minutes. So if somebody finishes in about 4, 5, 6 minutes, I'll be able to see that they didn't take it seriously, And I don't want to get into those kinds of discussions and arguments. So please just do the task seriously. It's actually a pretty fun one, interesting. The questions are pretty interesting. The scenario is interesting. Answer that. Just make sure you submit that. You finish this specific task by midnight of September 21st, next Monday. So after you finish watching Monday Night Football, make sure that you submit this task. And that's it for today. I will once again show you the Aggie band background. Encourage you to send me some of your own backgrounds as we had so far. And I will see you later this week. Bye, everyone.